The winter of 1942 was colder than most. Across the North Atlantic, convoys crawled through fog and sleet, hunted by German U-boats. Every week, another freighter disappeared beneath the waves. Britain was bleeding tonnage faster than it could build new ships. In London, inside the War Cabinet offices on Whitehall, a different kind of war was being fought, a war of ideas. Admirals demanded more escort carriers. Engineers argued that steel was too scarce. And somewhere between desperation and imagination, a radical proposal appeared. It came from a man few generals had ever heard of. Geoffrey Pyke, an eccentric British inventor with the mind of a scientist and the patience of a dreamer. He believed that the answer to Britain's shipping crisis lay not in metal, but in ice. Pyke's memo was only 3 pages long. Typed on cheap paper, it carried a title that sounded like a joke: Unsinkable Floating Platforms Made of Frozen Water. The file reached the desk of Lord Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations. Mountbatten, known for entertaining bold, sometimes impossible schemes, didn't laugh. He summoned Pyke at once. The meeting took place in an unheated room behind Whitehall. A fire flickered weakly in the grate. Pyke arrived carrying a small box filled with snow and wood shavings. He placed it on the table as Mountbatten looked on with curiosity. "This," Pyke said, his eyes wide behind wire-rimmed glasses, "is stronger than steel." Mountbatten raised an eyebrow. "Snow?" "Not just snow," Pyke replied. "A mixture, ice reinforced with sawdust, 14% wood pulp, 86% water. The particles interlock as they freeze. It forms a composite. I call it Pykrete." He drew a pistol from his pocket. Before anyone could stop him, he fired a single shot into the block. The bullet didn't shatter the ice. It buried itself, leaving only a small crater. Then Pyke took out a second block, pure ice, and fired again. The block exploded into fragments that skittered across the floor. Silence. Mountbatten walked to the table and touched the first block. The hole was shallow, edges clean. A material harder than ice, but lighter than steel. "What do you propose to do with it?" he asked. "Build ships," Pyke said simply. "Ships that cannot sink, because even when damaged, they float. Massive floating airstrips, cold as the sea itself. A city of ice." Mountbatten was intrigued. He sent a confidential memo to the Prime Minister. Churchill, who had a taste for the spectacular, read it overnight. In the margin, he scrawled, "This is extraordinary. Get on with it." And so Project Habakkuk was born, named after a biblical prophet who spoke of visions that would astonish nations. Its mission, to build a colossal aircraft carrier from Pykrete, a fortress of ice capable of operating in the frigid waters of the Atlantic. The code name was fitting. To some, the idea felt like prophecy. To others, madness. Within weeks, secret correspondence traveled between London, Ottawa, and Washington. The plan required an isolated site, cold, remote, invisible to spies. Canadian engineers suggested Lake Patricia, a frozen expanse inside Jasper National Park, Alberta. There, under the cover of Arctic winter, the first experiment would begin. Materials were simple: ice, wood pulp, wire mesh, refrigeration pipes. But the logistics were staggering. A full-scale Pykrete carrier would be 2,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, displacing over 2 million tons. Its walls would be 40 feet thick. The surface could host bombers, fuel depots, even radar stations. It sounded like science fiction, but in 1942, science fiction was often strategy. The test team gathered at Lake Patricia in January 1943. Temperatures plunged to -30. Among them were British naval officers, Canadian engineers, and civilian technicians who had signed papers forbidding them to speak a word about the project. Under the dim glow of kerosene lamps, they mixed water and wood pulp in barrels, poured it into wooden molds, and left the mixture to freeze. After several nights, they pulled out blocks that gleamed like marble but felt strangely fibrous. When the first bullet test succeeded, the men cheered. When the first block floated under a load that would have cracked pure ice, they believed. By March, a prototype structure stood on the frozen lake, 60 feet long, 20 feet wide, kept solid by a network of refrigeration coils powered by diesel generators. The ice didn't melt. It endured through thawing days and hard nights. Mountbatten flew to Canada in secrecy. Wrapped in a thick navy coat, he walked across the wooden planks that led to the frozen platform. Engineers stood stiffly at attention as he touched the icy wall with his glove. He smiled. "This," he said, "could change the war." He ordered film crews to record the experiment, but the footage was immediately classified. Back in London, he presented a small sample of Pykrete at a combined Chiefs of Staff meeting. To prove its strength, he demonstrated again with a pistol, and one stray bullet ricocheted, narrowly missing an American admiral. The room erupted in laughter and nervous applause. But the message was clear. The material was real. Soon, a design bureau was set up under the name Project Habakkuk. A second, larger variant, Habakkuk 2, was proposed for the Pacific. Blueprints showed refrigeration plants, hangars, gun batteries, even anti-submarine depth charge systems built into the hull. It would take 30,000 tons of wood pulp and 300,000 tons of steel for the pipes and machinery. The estimated cost, $10 million, more than a battleship. The idea was too big to ignore, and too strange to believe. Behind closed doors, Mountbatten defended Pyke's vision. He argued that while the project seemed absurd, the physics worked. Ice was cheap. Wood pulp was abundant. If the war dragged on, steel might become scarcer than courage. But not everyone agreed. Admiral Ernest King of the U.S. Navy demanded feasibility studies. Canadian officials warned of environmental hazards. Engineers questioned how to keep millions of tons of ice frozen while engines and guns generated heat. Pyke didn't care for bureaucracy. He believed that creative minds won wars, not committees. When asked if he had considered the melting problem, he answered, "Of course, we shall refrigerate the future." By late spring, Allied victories in the Atlantic began to shift momentum. Long-range Liberator bombers now patrolled convoy routes. New sonar and escort tactics reduced the U-boat threat. And suddenly, an ice aircraft carrier seemed less urgent. For Pyke, it was devastating. He had seen Pykrete as proof that imagination could save lives. Now, meetings grew shorter. Memos stopped arriving. Funding froze, and not in the way he had hoped. At Lake Patricia, the prototype remained. As summer returned, the refrigeration generators were shut off. The structure slowly began to soften. Cracks spread through its walls like veins. By August, only the wooden scaffolding poked through the water. Still, in the early mornings, the lake was quiet, and locals swore they could hear the faint hum of engines under the ice. Mountbatten, back in London, wrote a final report to Churchill. "Pykrete," he noted, "has remarkable properties, but the scale required exceeds our immediate capacity. The concept remains sound, perhaps ahead of its time." Churchill scribbled a single word in reply. "Regrettable." Soft music rises. Wind over ice. By the time the report reached Ottawa, winter had returned. On the surface of Lake Patricia, snow covered the last remains of the frozen experiment. Underneath, unseen in the dark water, fragments of Pykrete drifted like ghosts of an idea that once promised to change the war. The dream had not melted. It had simply sunk below the surface, waiting to be remembered. At dawn, The lake was silent again. Steam rose from the diesel generators that still hummed beneath the thin crust of snow. Inside a wooden shack, a small team of engineers packed their notebooks and cameras. They had captured something no one else had ever seen, a ship made of ice that could bear the weight of men, fuel, and machines. The official report called it a technical success. But success in wartime was measured not in marvels, but in production lines. The Admiralty wanted figures. How long, how much, how many? Pyke wanted imagination. By early 1943, London pressed for results. Mountbatten requested a full-scale design, complete with defensive guns, hangar bays, and refrigeration units that could run for months. A group of naval architects from the firm of Thornycroft and Company joined the study. So did Canadian engineers from the National Research Council. Their calculations filled entire walls with chalk formulas, density ratios, coolant flow, stress tolerances of frozen composites. The numbers were staggering. A single carrier would need over 2 million tons of Pykrete and a refrigeration plant equal to a small city's power grid. Pipes carrying brine would snake through every deck to maintain sub-zero temperatures. In theory, it would not melt even under tropical sun. In theory. To make the concept credible, the Allies turned to one of the most respected scientists in Britain, Professor J.D. Bernal of Birkbeck College, a crystallographer known for his wartime work on material strength. Bernal examined the samples and confirmed what Pyke had claimed. When reinforced with wood fibers, ice deformed instead of cracking. It absorbed impact like armor. He called it a triumph of improbable physics. Still, he warned that Pykrete's behavior under long exposure to stress was unpredictable. At minus 15 degrees, it was tough as oak. At minus 5, it began to creep and sag. Temperature would be both its weapon and its weakness. Meanwhile, the project's secrecy deepened. All correspondence was marked most secret. Canadian laborers at Lake Patricia were told they were constructing a water storage facility. The camp was fenced, guarded, and supplied through hidden convoys. Inside the workshop, Pyke moved restlessly between machines, sketching new shapes on the frost-covered windows. He envisioned modular sections, hollow blocks cooled from within by ammonia coils, joined by steel brackets. When assembled, they would form a hull half a kilometer long, able to host hundreds of aircraft. He named the idea Habakkuk Mark Thumors. He imagined future fleets, Habakkuk II and III, patrolling the Pacific. Mountbatten's staff prepared briefing papers for Washington. In March 1943, he flew to Canada with the latest samples. During a joint meeting in Quebec, he presented the material to the combined chiefs of staff, including Admiral King and General Arnold. The demonstration was pure theater. On a polished table lay 2 blocks, one of plain ice, one of Pykrete. Mountbatten raised a revolver and fired. The first block shattered instantly. The second stopped the bullet and sent the ricochet whizzing past startled officers. No one was hurt, but the effect was electric. The Americans were impressed, though not convinced. Churchill later wrote in his notes, "It is an astonishing substance, but it requires the climate of hell frozen over." Still, funds were approved for extended trials. A small laboratory opened in London's Smithfield Cold Storage Facility, where scientists studied how Pykrete aged. They froze beams for weeks, then loaded them with weights until cracks appeared. To their surprise, the material healed slightly when cooled again. Microscopic ice crystals fused together as if alive. Reports described it as self-repairing under proper refrigeration. But refrigeration was costly. The prototype on Lake Patricia already consumed thousands of gallons of diesel each week just to remain solid. Scaling that to an ocean vessel would require fuel ships merely to keep the giant cold. Pyke's letters grew more urgent. He proposed insulating layers of cork, reflective coatings, even snow-spraying systems to reduce heat absorption. His mind raced faster than the bureaucrats could reply. In one memo he wrote, "To abandon this because of cost is to abandon ingenuity itself." But ingenuity could not balance a budget. By summer, as Allied technology advanced elsewhere, escort carriers, improved radar, longer-range aircraft, Habakkuk's purpose began to fade. In Ottawa, officials debated what to do with the frozen prototype. It had survived through one full thaw without collapsing. Tourists who ventured near the restricted lake saw strange shapes beneath the surface, white ribs glinting under clear water. The engineers called it the ghost hull. Some wanted to preserve it as a scientific station. Others argued it should be dismantled to avoid leaks of coolant into the lake. Eventually, the order came. Shut down all operations, seal the records, and transfer remaining funds to other naval research. Pyke received the message in London. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in his coat pocket. For the first time in years, he had no project to chase, no experiment to defend. He was exhausted. Friends recalled him pacing the corridors of Combined Operations Headquarters, muttering that imagination was dying behind red tape. Mountbatten tried to reassure him. He promised that one day the world would recognize his vision. But Pyke knew the pattern too well. Innovation praised, then buried. Still, fragments of his idea lived on. Canadian engineers who had worked on Habakkuk later applied similar composite principles to Arctic construction and cold storage design. Scientists studying ice cores remembered his data. Even the U.S. Navy filed patents referencing reinforced frozen media. The dream had not entirely melted, it had simply drifted into science. In September 1943, as the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively in favor of the Allies, Pyke delivered one final memorandum to Mountbatten titled Strategic Value of Imagination. It was less a proposal than a plea. When the war ends, remember that victory was born not only of courage, but of thought. A single idea, if frozen in disbelief, is lost forever. Mountbatten kept that letter for decades. He would later call Pyke the most original mind ever wasted by war. Back on Lake Patricia, autumn winds returned. The prototype still stood, scarred, leaning, but intact. A local ranger who patrolled the area in 1944 described hearing hollow echoes when he tapped the ice with his boot, like knocking on a cathedral made of glass, he said. When the final thaw came, the structure slipped quietly beneath the surface. Some say parts of it remain there even now, preserved in the cold silt. Divers in later decades reported beams of ancient wood embedded in ice, smooth as stone. No monument marks the place, only the coordinates on forgotten maps. Jasper National Park, Alberta, Lake Patricia, 50 Second Sector North. Years later, scientists studying composite materials rediscovered Pyke's research notes. His strange frozen alloy inspired experiments in permafrost engineering and cryogenic storage. Modern composites, fiberglass, carbon fiber, reinforced polymers, all owe a silent debt to that wartime curiosity about ice and sawdust. Sound, gentle wind, distant engine rumble. The weapon was never built, but its idea endured. It showed that even in the darkest years of war, the human mind reached for impossible solutions. It reminded engineers that nature's simplest element, water, could be reshaped by will alone. The men who mixed those first barrels on Lake Patricia may not have changed the war, but they changed how we imagined matter itself. When the last page of the Habakkuk file was declassified decades later, a note was found clipped to the cover. Written in Mountbatten's handwriting, it read, "Do not mock what once gave us hope." And below, in faded pencil, another line, almost certainly Pyke's own. Ice melts, ideas don't. London, winter of 1944. The war had entered its final, brutal phase. In the cold corridors of Combined Operations Headquarters, new maps covered the walls: Normandy, Anzio, Arnhem. The names of operations shifted weekly, but one file no one touched anymore bore a simple title: Project Habakkuk. It sat on a shelf in Mountbatten's office, thick with dust and red tape. A strange relic of a moment when hope had frozen into ambition. And for Geoffrey Pyke, the man who had dreamed it, that silence became unbearable. Pyke had always been more than an inventor. He was a thinker, a philosopher of war. During the Blitz, he had designed portable fuel systems and silent snow vehicles for commandos. He worked tirelessly, often through the night, sketching ideas on scraps of paper. He believed that imagination was the only true weapon against chaos. But as 1944 unfolded, he found himself excluded from briefings. The scientific committees that once hailed his creativity now saw him as unstable, brilliant but unpredictable. His manner was eccentric, his ideas too bold for men who wanted stability. He still sent letters to Mountbatten, each more desperate than the last. One read, "If we stop imagining, we start dying long before the battle ends." Most were never answered. By summer, Pyke had retreated into solitude. He lived in a small London flat cluttered with sketches and melted samples of Pykrete. He kept a notebook labeled, "What Might Have Been." Inside were new designs: ice domes for polar research, floating hospitals, even refrigerated habitats for desert troops. Each page was carefully drawn, precise, visionary. But the war no longer needed visionaries. It needed production, numbers, speed. Steel had returned to the factories, and with it, the comfort of conventional thinking. Meanwhile, Lake Patricia thawed again. The last fragments of the frozen prototype drifted apart beneath the surface. Fishermen in Jasper said the water shimmered strangely that year, as if sunlight reflected off something buried deep below. A Canadian ranger collected a small piece that washed ashore, a lump of ice with embedded wood fibers, perfectly preserved. He kept it in his freezer for years before it finally vanished one summer night. In Britain, Pyke's health began to fail. The stress of isolation, combined with exhaustion and depression, took its toll. He continued to propose projects: solar energy collectors, mobile classrooms for post-war reconstruction. But few listened. To the ministries, he was the man who wanted to build an aircraft carrier out of ice. A curiosity, a footnote, an eccentric footnote at that. Mountbatten, though still sympathetic, had moved on to new responsibilities in Southeast Asia Command. He carried with him a small vial of frozen Pykrete from the Lake Patricia experiment. Occasionally, during strategy sessions in Ceylon, he would show it to officers and tell the story. Most would smile politely. Few grasped the meaning behind it. The war ended in 1945. London celebrated. The world exhaled. But Pyke didn't join the celebrations. He watched the parades from his window, the victory flags fluttering above streets rebuilt from rubble. To him, peace felt strangely quiet, an age where ideas no longer had urgency. He was 52, and his mind refused to rest. He began studying post-war economics, convinced that the same imagination used to fight war could be used to rebuild the world. He wrote essays on education, technology, and social reform. Few were published. He sent drafts to ministries, universities, newspapers. Most came back unread. In 1948, Geoffrey Pyke checked into a small hotel in Paddington, London. He left no forwarding address. The next morning he was found in his room. He had taken his own life. On the desk lay a letter addressed to his son. Do not be afraid of being absurd. Absurdity is often the first step toward truth. I hope one day the world will forgive my imagination. The newspapers barely noticed. A short obituary in the Times described him as a man of unusual ideas, once associated with experimental wartime materials. Nothing more. Yet those who had known him remembered differently. To Mountbatten, Pyke's death was a personal loss. He wrote privately, "He saw the possible when others saw only ice." Years later, when the secrecy around Project Habakkuk was lifted, Mountbatten insisted that Pyke's role be acknowledged. He called for a formal recognition of the man who had dared to dream of ships made of ice and sawdust. But history moved on quickly. The Cold War had begun, and new projects, atomic submarines, guided missiles, jet engines, seized the spotlight. Habakkuk faded into the archives. Only fragments of documentation remained: technical drawings, temperature logs, test photos from the frozen lake. In 1971, a Canadian diving team exploring Lake Patricia stumbled upon something extraordinary. At a depth of 30 feet, their lights revealed a mass of pale material, unlike rock or ice. It was fibrous, solid, and cold even under modern wetsuits. Samples confirmed what few believed could still exist: Pykrete, preserved after almost 30 years. The mixture of ice and sawdust had survived, trapped in the lake's cold strata. Scientists analyzed it and confirmed the remarkable stability of the material. Even partially melted, it retained its composite structure. The discovery reignited interest in Pyke's work. For a brief moment, his name resurfaced in journals of materials, science, and engineering history. But as with all rediscoveries, the excitement faded. Still, something had shifted: a quiet respect, an understanding that his mind had been decades ahead of its time. Today, at the edge of Lake Patricia, there is no monument, no plaque, no sign. Only still water and a view of the distant mountains. But beneath that calm surface lie the remains of an idea. Frozen, enduring, invisible to most who pass by. Every winter, divers report faint outlines beneath the ice, long shadows, like ribs of a sleeping giant. If one listens closely, the lake still whispers when the wind cuts across it, a sound like cracking glass and distant applause. Perhaps it's imagination, perhaps it's memory. In a museum in Portsmouth, among displays of steel warships and aircraft parts, a small sample sits quietly in a glass case. A cube of pale material, rough to the touch, labeled simply Pykrete, experimental composite, 1942-43, courtesy of the Mountbatten Archive. Visitors rarely stop to look, but those who do often linger, reading the small text below. A mixture of ice and sawdust once imagined as the future of naval warfare. Proposed by Geoffrey Pyke, Project Habakkuk remains a testament to human ingenuity in times of desperation. Sound, low hum, soft wind, archival projector click. The weapon made from ice and sawdust was never built. It never fired a shot, never sailed a mile. But in its brief existence, it embodied something no factory could mass produce: the courage to believe in impossible things. Pyke's story reminds us that history isn't shaped only by victories or inventions that succeed. It is also shaped by the ones that melt, slowly, quietly, leaving behind the clear outline of what might have been. Every war creates its ghosts. Some are of men, others are of ideas, and sometimes, as on that frozen Canadian lake, those ghosts never truly disappear. The war ended long ago, but in quiet corners of archives, a thin folder marked Habakkuk still gathers dust. Inside, pages are fragile, typed in fading ink. Diagrams show cross-sections of ice blocks, coolant pipes, and stress calculations written in careful pencil. In the margins, one note stands out: Mountbatten's handwriting. It could have worked. The phrase feels almost defiant, as if he was speaking to time itself. After 1945, Britain's priorities changed overnight. The country was rebuilding, rationing, surviving. There was no money left for dream projects made of frozen water. But in laboratories across Europe, the war's strange inventions had left a mark: radar, jet propulsion, code-breaking, synthetic fuel. And hidden among them, forgotten but not erased, was the memory of Pykrete. The story of the ice weapon became a kind of legend in scientific circles, whispered at conferences, laughed about in bars, yet always retold with a trace of wonder. "Did you know," someone would say, "that Britain once planned to build an aircraft carrier out of ice?" People laughed, then leaned closer to hear how serious that idea really was. In 1951, a Canadian engineer named Max Perutz, who had studied glacier movement during the war, began research into the molecular behavior of ice under pressure. His early experiments referenced Pyke's Pykrete data. Perutz would go on to win the Nobel Prize for mapping the structure of hemoglobin. But his fascination with frozen composites began with that secret wartime file. He once told a student, "We laughed at the ice ship, but it taught us that matter itself is not fixed. Only our imagination is." Meanwhile, the Cold War was taking shape. Across the Arctic Circle, new military installations were being planned. Radar lines, submarine bases, early warning outposts. Engineers studying ice stability in permafrost zones rediscovered Pyke's equations on stress distribution. They applied similar logic to frozen runways and ice bridges. Without realizing it, they were using the ghost mathematics of Project Habakkuk. In Alaska, Canadian and American scientists experimented with reinforced snow shelters for aircraft. The mixture they used, water, pulp, and air, bore an uncanny resemblance to Pykrete. Reports described it as a practical derivative of wartime research. Pyke's name, however, was nowhere to be found. Back in Britain, the 1950s brought modernization, new laboratories, atomic power, and the first computing machines. Young scientists discovered Pyke's writings in Mountbatten's archive, essays on innovation, energy, and social design. He had even imagined machines that learn from data, decades before the term artificial intelligence existed. To them, Pyke was no longer a mad inventor. He was a prophet of applied imagination. In 1960, the BBC produced a short radio documentary about Britain's strangest weapon. It featured interviews with Mountbatten, surviving engineers, and Canadian locals from Jasper. The narrator's voice, low and calm, described how a man once tried to build a fortress out of ice. The program ended with the sound of wind over water and the faint crackle of ice breaking. Listeners wrote letters asking if the story was true. The BBC confirmed it was. But truth, as it often does, felt stranger than invention. At Lake Patricia, the years passed quietly. The forest thickened around the shoreline. Tourists came to canoe, unaware of what lay beneath. Only a few old guides remembered the winter when soldiers and scientists built something impossible there. They spoke of generators humming under snow, of men mixing pulp and water by lantern light, of laughter echoing across frozen air. In 1973, a local diver, Derek Pierce, returned with a small camera and filmed the lakebed. His footage showed faint lines, curved like the ribs of a ship, encased in silt and shadow. The film ran for only 3 minutes, enough to prove the remains still existed. When broadcast later on Canadian television, the narrator said softly, "Here lies a dream that refused to melt." In the decades that followed, engineers continued to study composites inspired by Pyke's frozen blend. Fiberglass, carbon fiber, and icecrete. Each sought the same balance of strength and lightness. NASA scientists studying cryogenic materials even cited Pykrete as a conceptual ancestor to modern thermal shielding. A strange idea born in wartime now quietly influenced spacecraft bound for the stars. And yet, outside the labs, few remembered the man who started it all. No museum bore his name. No lecture hall carried his portrait. Only fragments, letters, test photos, a revolver scar in a block of ice. In 1988, the British National Archives finally declassified the full Habakkuk file. Historians leafed through the yellowed pages with disbelief. There were temperature logs from Lake Patricia, typed witness reports, and Mountbatten's original memos to Churchill. One document listed the costs. Estimated expenditure, $10,000. Steel requirement, 30,000 tons. Cooling capacity, 33,000 kilowatts. Another, written in Churchill's handwriting, read, "Pykrete is a curious substance, neither solid nor liquid, but symbolic of British persistence." The press rediscovered the story. Headlines called it, "The Ice Ship That Never Was." For a brief moment, Geoffrey Pyke was remembered, the eccentric genius who saw strength in fragility. Historians debated whether Habakkuk could ever have worked. Some claimed it was doomed by physics, impossible to maintain, impractical to build. Others argued it might have succeeded if the war had lasted another year. But in truth, success or failure mattered less than what it represented. Project Habakkuk had proven that even under existential threat, humanity could look beyond destruction toward creation. It showed that desperation and imagination are often the same thing wearing different uniforms. Sound, faint projector hum, pages turning. In one of Mountbatten's later speeches, delivered to the Royal Institution in 1965, he ended with a line that could have come straight from Pyke's notebooks. "War is tragedy, but in its urgency we glimpse the full scale of human invention. We learn not just how to fight, but how to dream under pressure." He paused, then smiled. "And sometimes, gentlemen, those dreams are made of ice." Today, scientists at the University of Alberta occasionally dive beneath Lake Patricia to study the remaining fragments. The temperature below 30 feet stays near freezing year-round. When lights sweep across the bottom, they reveal pale streaks and faint curves, still intact after 8 decades. A few blocks have been brought up and refrozen in transparent resin, silent relics of a world at war and of an idea that refused to die. On cold mornings, mist drifts over the lake like breath. The mountains reflect in the still water, sharp and calm. If you didn't know, you'd never guess that beneath that peace lies the ghost of a ship, not made of steel or wood, but of faith in human ingenuity. Each winter, snow falls over the surface, sealing it again. It's easy to imagine Mountbatten and Pyke standing side by side, watching the ice thicken, arguing, dreaming, believing. Soft orchestral music swells. The weapon made from ice and sawdust was never fired, but its story continues to echo through history, a testament to the belief that even in the darkest winters, imagination can burn brighter than any flame. It was never about the material. It was about the courage to see potential in the impossible, to look at ice and see strength, to look at war and see creation. In the end, the world didn't build Pyke's frozen fortress, but the mind that imagined it still stands, somewhere between myth and memory, preserved like the lake that keeps his secret. And if history has any justice, it will remember him not for the weapon that never was, but for the dream that refused to melt.